the atheist types, the rationalist types, there's something they miss. And what they miss is that fiction isn't false. It's not a lie, right? It's not literal, but it's not a lie. And great fiction is true, but it never happened. So how can it be true? And the answer to that is something like, well, there are patterns in things, deep recurring patterns. You know, human nature, the fact that we're human, that the humanity itself is a recurring pattern. It has characteristic shape. And great fiction describes the shape of that pattern. And the greatest of fiction, the greater fiction becomes, the more it is religious in nature. And that's not even a claim about the nature of truth. It's more a claim about the nature of experience. You know, when we say something is profound, what we mean is that it's moving and that it has a broad influence. It's capable of having a broad influence on the way we think and see and act. So if you read a profound book, like one of Dostoevsky's books, you could say of that book, and people often do, that it changed my life when I read that book. And a story that can change your life has a power that is best described as religious. And so religious is a kind of experience in some sense, rather, in addition to a claim about what constitutes truth. And then those stories in Genesis, Cain and Abel, I think, and the story of Adam and Eve, because those stories are so deep that it's almost unfathomable. They get at the most profound of patterns. And so to say that they're literally true is actually to massively underestimate how true they are. Because you could tell me what you did this morning, and that would be literally true, but like, who cares? Whereas if you read the story of Adam and Eve, it's so true that it applies to everyone always. And mere literal truth can't do that. And we don't have a good language as scientists, let's say, as psychologists, or even as citizens. We don't have a good language for that kind of truth. And so, well, I guess I'd like your thoughts about that idea.
Yeah, so the literal sense of Scripture is sometimes misunderstood by people. And I think the right way to think of it, the literal sense of Scripture, is what the original human author intended to convey to the original human audience. And so if we're looking at Genesis, I think that we need to put Genesis back in its context. If you read Genesis as if it is a contemporary textbook on science, I think what you're doing is wrenching it out of its original context, and therefore you're bound to misread it. And that's true of not just Genesis, it's really true of any work, that to understand it, we need to understand its genre, and we need to understand its context. So what is the original context of the Genesis story? Well, the original context, it was written in terms of rival stories of creation, other stories that were circulating in the ancient world, and it was meant to be an answer to those. And it uses poetry, it uses imagery, and that was what all those stories did. And the poetry and the imagery, I would not set that against truth, as if on the one hand you have truth, and the other hand you have poetry, imagery, and story. I think that one kind of truth is scientific truth, the empirically verifiable, but I think it's too narrow to say, well, the only kind of truth is the empirically verifiable. I think truth actually is broader. And in fact, that claim that the truth is empirically verifiable, that's the only kind of truth, that is itself a self-defeating statement, right? There's no empirical evidence that the only way to get the truth is through the empirical method. So if we put Genesis back in its context, what do we see? Well, we see it is a story telling us about, in contrast to the other stories in the ancient world were stories in which there were multiple gods. They engaged in a warfare and violence. So you think of the Greek myths are like this, where, right, Zeus overthrows his father and there's all this violence. And Genesis is meant to answer these other ancient myths. And it's saying things like there's only one God, there's not multiple. Secondly, that creation is not a matter of violence, but that the creation is reasonable speech. And this was something that you talked about in your lecture, which really struck me, because I obviously had read that story before, but I never really thought of it, that, well, creation arrives, right? God says, let there be light, and there was light. And what is reasonable speech? Reasonable speech is orderly. right? The difference between, random sounds you make and reasonable speech is that there's a kind of order to it. So if creation arises from reasonable speech, then creation itself is ordered. It's intelligible. It makes sense. And that gives rise centuries and centuries later, that belief that creation is orderly and makes sense gives rise centuries later to science. Mm-hmm. But to read Genesis as if it's failed science makes about as much sense as to read Genesis as if it's, for or against iPhones. I mean, imagine somebody reading Genesis and they're like, well, should I buy an iPhone or not? I'm not going to read Genesis to determine this. Well, clearly, the original author of Genesis wasn't addressing that. And the original author of Genesis wasn't addressing for or against evolution. So I think that these readers who want to make it for or against evolution are just utterly misreading and taking the story out of its original context, and therefore necessarily providing a really bad reading of Genesis.
There's also a really important theological point to make here as well, and that's, I could put it philosophically, what's the condition for the possibility of something being literal in the first place? What's the condition for the possibility both of it being recognized, spoken, and then apprehended? There's a certain kind of orderliness that's necessarily presupposed in the act of knowing and in the act of communicating that knowledge that itself, as Chris said, can't be empirically verified. So when we as Catholics say that recognize from the New Testament that Jesus is the truth, that would include, in a literal historical sense, but also the condition for the possibility of anything being intelligible and literally understood and communicated at all. So I think one of the frustrations I find in contemporary debates on these questions is that secularism oftentimes isolates and identifies the literal, the empirical, as if this is just a freestanding epistemic platform that belongs to them, and everybody has to compete in order to be on their territory. And I just don't think that's philosophically the case. It presupposes a lot of things that they can't give an account for.
Yeah, I mean,
so
one more little.
Yep, please go ahead.
No, I just was going to add one thing. So imagine somebody was reading Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So imagine somebody reads that and they're like, okay, Shakespeare's a meteorologist. He's a weatherman. And I'm going to look up in the almanac to see if May had rough winds. And that turns out there's no rough winds in May. Oh, Shakespeare, you're about it at telling us about the weather. Well, I think that's obviously a radical misunderstanding of Shakespeare. He's not trying to tell us the weather and then failing to tell us the weather. And so I think Genesis is not trying and failing to give us scientific truths. It's just doing something totally different. And that's part of the reason
Yes.
I appreciated your lectures, is that you highlighted the reality that the author of Genesis is trying to communicate very important truths, but not truths that are in the scientific discourse. They're true, but not scientific truths.
The problem with the empirical approach, the problem with totalizing it, is that the empirical approach tends to be mostly descriptions of things and the way they interact and the way they can be manipulated. And that's fine, but it doesn't provide any real insight into how to live, how to act, how to take your next step, how to produce a hierarchy of values, and how to determine what's most important and what's least important. And all of that is also so difficult that we actually don't know how to do it completely explicitly, which is why we need poetry and drama and literature. We need that whole domain, so we could call that the literary domain. And then I think you could consider it, this might be an empirical proposition, is that the religious domain is at the base of the literary domain, and as literature gets deeper, it becomes more and more like religious writing. And so that by definition, in some sense, and I've swiped this in part, I would say, from Jung, is almost by definition that the sense of profound engagement that the most profound literature produces is what constitutes the religious. And that's a domain of experience. When you're captivated in a movie theater, when you're captivated by a story, when you're taken outside yourself, none of that has anything to do with logical argumentation. it's a whole different issue. And to me, it's tied very, very deeply to our ability to imitate and mimic. And so we're really good at that, way better than any other animal. Like language is mimicry. We use the same words. And so we're mimicking each other. But I can't mimic every person separately. I have to extract out from each person some essence of being that's admirable. And I do that person after person, and I try to imitate that. And then that core thing that's admirable that I imitate, that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's psychologically equivalent to Christ. Whatever else Christ is, that's why he's sometimes described as the King of Kings. It's like if the king is the thing that's at the top of the hierarchy, and then you look at all hierarchies and you take the thing that's at the top of all hierarchies of value, then that figure, when you see reflections of that figure anywhere, it produces awe and respect. And that's because that pattern constitutes the appropriate way to act, just as when you see the opposite of that pattern, which might be in its most fundamental essence satanic or demonic, it's something that's ultimately evil, that produces revulsion and terror. And that's all instinctual. It's not in the domain of rationality precisely. It's way, way deeper.